Welcome to The Business That Pays with Adam Tolliver from Artisan Financial Strategies, where we mind the business that pays you. In this podcast, we empower successful families and business owners to make informed decisions about their finances through courageous conversations. Through his expertise as a practicing investment advisor representative with Eagle Strategies, LLC, a registered investment advisor, Adam teaches you how to create a wealth ecosystem by combining a practical technical framework with your personal, family, and community values. Join us for this journey where Adam normalizes sustainable wealth building and gives you the keys to make courageous, proactive financial decisions.
A successful transition of wealth from one generation to the next can be done with respect and love, but it takes preparation. Adam Tolliver understands the need for planning and talking, and he's here to discuss the family wealth roadmap to intergenerational success. I'm Patrice Sikora. Adam, there is an ancient Chinese proverb, wealth does not pass 3 generations. And then we've got an American saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Why does it seem to happen that way?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. Really, the primary reason that I say is really about intentionality. It's about conversations and planning, and then having a practical framework about how do we actually grow, protect, sustain, and then transfer wealth from one generation to the next. And in particular, that third generation is very tricky because it's what we refer to as the cousin generation. Things start to grow exponentially from that generation. So we start with a patriarch, a matriarch who creates wealth in some way. Maybe it's a business, maybe they've just been successful professionally, or whatever the impetus is for the initial wealth. And then the second generation, maybe it's one child or maybe it's 2. And typically, let's just assume that there are multiple children at that second generation. When they have children, we've now got exponential growth. Mm-hmm. And there's a bit more complication about how do we as a family, because family, that tent is getting wider and wider. How do we as a family approach our wealth? And our wealth becomes a more serious conversation when it's not just a mom and a dad and children, but it's siblings and their children, and then those children and their spouses. And so you see how the tent needs to keep getting bigger, and the conversations are more difficult to wrangle because there's more stakeholders involved.
And it would suggest to me that talking becomes so much more important. Conversations to pass on what it is you would like as your legacy in a matter of your priorities.
Exactly. And priorities compete, right? The more people you have, the more opinions, the more preferences, the more desires. And so it becomes a lot more difficult. And the reality is there is a conflict because, well, one, there's a conflict because we're talking about money and people, but there's also sort of the philosophical and emotional conflict within people, because the bigger that tent gets, the deeper generations we get into wealth within a family, the more we actually need to become more professional and sort of institutional in the way we approach our family. And that is not something that's natural. It's not something that people really want to do. But if you have this asset or group of assets known as wealth, financial wealth, real assets, real wealth, you do have to, if the goal is to protect and preserve it, be a bit more intentional than the typical family is around what happens, how it happens, when it happens, why it happens with that wealth.
Talk to me then about the family wealth roadmap that you've developed here.
Yeah, so I developed this because it is a very common sort of buzzword that's used. People say generational wealth, generational wealth. And I think in a lot of ways it's discussed in an abstract way. So I wanted to bring something practical to it based on my experience as a financial advisor, a wealth manager, working with people every day on how to protect and manage the wealth that they are building and have built. And giving a roadmap in a way that's simple, easy to understand, even though the subject itself and the exercise itself can very quickly become complicated and difficult. So I just wanted to be able to communicate this in a way that I think most people can wrap their heads around and bring that to a base level of understanding.
Well, you've got three components to your roadmap: funding, planning, and then administration and execution. How do they all work together?
Yeah, so all three components of the plan are critically important, and some of them seem, at face value, very simple, right? Like obviously, if we're talking about wealth, there has to be some sort of source of wealth. So where does the funding come from? But I always make sure to touch on this point because I don't want it to be taken for granted. Sometimes people want to have conversations about financial literacy, and if we know better, we can do better. And all of those are very true things. So financial literacy is great, but people do need finances. They need actual funding. And so when I think about funding, I think about the enhancement of skills and earning potential. So if you are in a family that has not generated pre-existing wealth, so you don't have any wealth to speak of that you can lean on from generation before you or extended family, then you've got to earn that wealth one way or another. If you're a W-2 employee, that means working in industries that pay substantial salaries. That means developing the skills, the education necessary to obtain those salaries. If you're an entrepreneur, that's another way that people generate wealth. All of these things are, of course, easier said than done. It's easier to say, hey, build a successful business than to actually build a successful business. Mm-hmm. But these are the things that generate wealth. There has to be some engine of wealth generation that spurs the initial wealth for a family if we're going to talk about generational wealth. And then another way, of course, is investing. And investing for one generation may be a slow, steady pace, right? If you've got a modest income, and you're making and saving and investing what you can as you go, if you're smart about it and consistent and stay the course, you can generate a level of wealth that was previously not available in your family. And that's important. It needs to be done if you're going to have a shot at anything generational. It has to start at one generation, right? And then the other side of that is leverage and efficiency. So that's when we get into the importance of good insurance and estate planning, because it is possible for even those of relatively meager means and incomes to leverage their way into creating an opportunity for wealth to be created and sustained within their families. So funding is about all of those things. Some people are at some point maybe going to do all three of those things in their lifetimes. They're going to earn a high salary using the skills and education that they've garnered. Maybe they're going to start a business one day, and maybe they're going to be able to leave a legacy through good estate and insurance planning. But one of the three, certainly. But if you can knock out two of them or three, then that would be amazing. So funding is just critical because we need something by the way of financial wealth if we're talking about generational wealth.
And you touched on the next step in there when you're talking about planning, estate planning. So let's move from funding to planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the planning phase is as you are accumulating wealth, as you are earning dollars, as you are saving and investing dollars. When you're managing your wealth, you would like to have a central plan. And of course, as a financial planner, we believe in planning being an ongoing iterative process, right? So over time, you've got, for lack of a better term, a roadmap, a sort of if this, then that. We know the facts and figures of your situation. We know the motivations of your family and what it is that's important to you, what your values are, and can use those facts and figures to shape how we manage your money as it grows over time. And in planning, we've had this conversation before, Patrice, about understanding what our wealth is beyond dollars and cents. Mm-hmm. And that becomes critically important when we're talking about all of this, right? So there is financial wealth, but then there's also intellectual capital. There is social wealth. There are the values and beliefs that we pass down, the stories about our family that we pass down. these are some of the things that make the plan and the stickiness of the values that we have transfer along with money to help people be better prepared to actually manage money when they receive it. So planning is critically important, and you can't do it without intentionality and having a team of professionals that are aligned and helping you along the way.
And when you're dealing with generations, as you say, the cousin effect, the bigger and bigger tent, the values, the planning plays such a much bigger role.
Absolutely. If you've got a bunch of different people who are just kind of doing their own thing, and there's no cohesiveness to the way that we intend to approach. And this can be, we talk about conflict. This can be difficult because people don't necessarily want to lose their individuality just because they're a part of a family, right? And they shouldn't necessarily have to. So it's, again, these are things that logically make sense, but in practice are not always that easy to execute on. So you've got to have thoughtful and intentional conversations about what are our shared values and how do we make sure that we make space for the individuals in our family to operate within that value system, so that when we put a plan together, and within a plan, we are going to have multiple plans because we've got multiple households and we've got multiple people all within the same family, right? And so how we make space for the people in our plan, in our family, those stakeholders, is really important. And it's difficult to do if we, one, if we're just kind of winging it, and then two, if we're not consistent, consistent about revisiting our planning, making sure that it's still relevant, making sure that we've got buy-in from the people who are stakeholders. All of that is really important.
Consistency, that would be so important, I think.
Absolutely.
All right. This all brings us to the administration and the execution of this. You mentioned processes, getting people on the same value page, the consistency. It all comes down to execution.
Yes, execution. And administration and execution is about who does what and when, and what do we do when certain things happen. What do we do when someone passes away? What do we do when someone is ill? What happens next if someone is incapacitated? What do we do when funds transfer? What are the plans for those dollars? What are the community organizations and associations that we have charitable relationships with? Who manages those relationships? Who do we call? Who are our professional advisors? Who's the financial advisor? Who's the accountant? Who's the estate planning attorney? Having clear instruction and expectations about what happens, when it happens, how it happens, helps in a number of ways. One, it cuts down on potential mistakes. If you know who your stakeholders are, so you know who your professional advisors are, you know who the family members and potentially friends or associates that are considered in a financial plan and execution, when you know who your community stakeholders are, you can cut down on a lot of unnecessary motion. And to be clear, I'm talking about this from a perspective that is highly technical right now. But when we're talking about the transfer of wealth, we are also typically talking about an inflection point in people's lives where there may be grief, there may be trauma, there may be tragedy. And believe it or not, this technical envelope that we're talking about things in actually helps alleviate some of the grief. Now, grief is a very, how can I put it? Grief is not something that impacts everyone the same way. And in times of grief, a lot of things may happen. People may respond unpredictably. They may, some people will busy themselves. Some people will sink into reclusion. But if we've got a plan and clear instructions, it alleviates a lot of the wondering, the confusion, and it actually makes the grieving process just a little bit easier. Not easy, because grief, as I said, is one of those things that impacts a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But if we have a clear plan, we give ourselves a good shot of not losing things or missing important points along the way. And communication is clear, expectations are clear, and we can hopefully prevent things like infighting or hurt feelings and all of the things that come with nasty estate horror stories that we tend to hear, or some may have experienced at some point.
With that in mind, when should these administration and execution guidelines, rules be set up? Should it be the first generation or the second generation?
It is an ongoing, so every generation needs to okay. And really what it takes for a family is to get into the practice of having the conversations. And these are not easy conversations. We talk about courageous conversations. This is where it comes from. I'm of the belief that fortunes are lost and created in conversations that are had and not had within families. And if we can't discuss sort of the discomfort of death, the discomfort of divorce, the discomfort of illness, sickness, injury, disability, things that happen to real families all the time, we find ourselves really kind of lost and overwhelmed, in understandably so, because those are traumatic inflection points in people's lives. But we do have the ability to plan for them in advance. And some of them are inevitable things that are going to happen, right? So some of those are like in case, if this happens. But things like passing away, we should always have a plan for what's going to happen then, because last I checked, 2 out of 2 of us, you know what I mean, at some point.
Yes.
So while it is uncomfortable, it is a reality. And if we are having conversations about generational wealth, you've already admitted to yourself that at some point, the next generation is going to be in your place. And so if we want to be mindful of the way and intentional of the way that happens, we have to get in the practice of having the conversations. So generation 1 needs to get in the practice of talking with each other and talking to generation 2. Generation 2 needs to get in the practice of talking to generation 1 and preparing generation 3. And so that process is ongoing and iterative and needs to happen on a consistent basis.
Should these be formal discussions, or is informal? Well, I should think if it were informal and things weren't written down, you're going to have questions and he said, she said, perhaps. So is a formal discussion with the entire family or the generation the preferred way to get this done?
The further down the tree we go, the more formal the conversation tends to need to get, just because, again, it gets unwieldy when we have so many people. So when we get to generation 3, that's when we're talking about things like family governance, which, going back to that earlier point, people don't necessarily want to institutionalize their families, right? Like, your family is about love and connection and relationships. So you don't want to think about your family itself as a business or an institution. But when you're dealing with significant wealth, which hopefully, if you're building wealth through generations, eventually that wealth does become significant, you need to have some sort of regular cadence of how frequently you meet, and some sort of formal rules of engagement about how you meet and the conversations that are had. And that looks different for every family. Every family has its own personality and personalities, of course, but it does start to get more and more formal. Initial conversations, you really are just kind of breaking the ice. Generation 1 with each other, generation 1 with generation 2. You are sort of planting the seeds for, this is what we want to happen. We'd like to know what you want to happen. This is our thinking about why we want it to happen this way. Having the conversation really kind of lays the groundwork for establishing family shared values, right? So, and values differ from generation to generation and within generations. A brother and a sister, or 2 sisters or 2 brothers, may not have the same values or intentions for what they want to have. They might not have the same charitable inclinations. When we're dealing with things like family businesses, there may be a business active child and a non-business active child. So there's all sorts of nuances that occur, but breaking the ice and beginning the conversation can help us avoid some of those catastrophic fallouts that happen when we don't really know what fairness and equality looks like and what we leave behind in the next generation, because we haven't created the space to have that conversation.
Can Generation 1 bring a lot to the table with Generation 3?
Yes, that's a great question. Absolutely. A big part, you mentioned the Chinese proverb at the beginning of the episode. A big part of the disconnect tends to be Generation 3 doesn't always have a full appreciation of where the existing wealth and comfort and opportunity came from. And this goes back to making sure that when we talk about passing down wealth, we're not just talking about money. We're talking about values. We're talking about stories. We're talking about a family history, staying connected to how this happened, why this happened, and leaving those stories behind, reinforcing those stories, and really sort of the core values and reasons why we were able to get to where we are, and making sure that those values are passed down and carried on are a big part of how you sustain wealth through multiple generations.
That is a lot to think about. It's a very good jumping off point to have your conversation with your kids. So how can listeners reach you, Adam? I mean, I'm sure there are generations out there that could use some guidance.
Absolutely. You can reach me at workingwithadam.com. I would absolutely love to speak to anyone about this topic. Of course, financial planning in general, and also this family wealth roadmap is a conversation that I have with employee resource groups at companies all over the country. So if anyone would like to have sort of a more formal presentation of this conversation and what the wealth roadmap looks like, let me know. Fantastic.
Thank you, Adam. So much more of life is about family, isn't it? It's something
Absolutely.
you can't get away from.
Cannot.
No. All right, listeners, follow this podcast for new shows, share with others, and let Adam know what you're thinking as well. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for listening to Business That Pays. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of the Artisan Financial Strategies or Eagle Strategies, LLC, a registered investment advisor. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial professional provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment strategies.
Adam Tolliver, registered representative offering securities through NY Life Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a licensed insurance agency. 1125 Cambridge Square, Suite C, Alpharetta, Georgia, 30009, 404-210-9311. Financial advisor offering investment advisory services through Eagle Strategies, LLC, a registered investment advisor. NY Life Securities, LLC, and Eagle Strategies, LLC are New York Life companies. Artisan Financial Strategies, LLC is not owned or operated by NY Life Securities, LLC, or its affiliates. Neither Artisan Financial Strategies, LLC, nor its advisors provide tax, legal, or accounting advice.